Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Dharma Breeze. I'd like us to start with a short silent meditation. So if you could please sit firmly in your chair with your back straight, your feet flat on the floor, and your shoulders relaxed. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Dats, Namo Dats. So if everybody could please join me in chanting the Junirai. This is one of my favorite sutras that we have, and I think sometimes we don't chant it as much on Sundays because it's a little bit longer. And as accommodation, I would like us to try to chant it a little bit faster than maybe we would on a Sunday service. So please join me in chanting the Junirai. Genshu Tenni Shokugyo Amida Senyo Zokuson Zai Mimyu Anako Muryo Bushi Shui Nyu Konjiki Shinjo Nyosen no Shabbatagyo nyozobu Ryomoku jonyaku shorenge Koga chorai midason Menzen enjo nyomangatsu Iko yunyo sen nichigatsu Shonyo tenku kushira Koga chorai minason Kwannon chodai kwan juju Shuju myoso hoshogon Nobuku gedo makyoman Koga chorai minason Mubi muku koshojo Shutoku kyoketsu nyokoku Shosari yakutoku jizai Koga chorai minason 十法名門菩薩衆、無料小魔上三段、一生修上願力中、古賀将来未来尊、根体保険知証系、前言症状明大座、おひざ上如線の古賀将来未来尊、実法将来勝負し、権限人図しやなく、戦後草原上業、古賀将来未来尊、小無常無我と、薬尿水月伝尿路、一種説法無明寺、古賀将来未来尊、一尊excuse me, 一尊仏説無悪名、薬無女人悪道夫、主任心身教悲尊、古賀将来未来尊、一尊無料法勉強、無少種悪知識、往生不大志菩提、古賀将来未来尊、合説非尊功徳寺、修善無変、如海水、小逆前言、小乗者、エッセ種、上小非国、ナマダム、ナマダブ、ナマダブ、ナマダブ、ナマダブ、ナマダブ、ガンニシクドク、平等正祭、同つ菩提心、往生安楽と。Namadots, namadots, 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 namadots. So good evening again, everyone. Tonight's Dharma talk, I'm going to be talking about some of the ritual that we do here in Jodo Shinshu. I'm going to be talking about some of the rituals that we do around people's passing, but the main point of this talk is not talking about impermanence or how Buddhists understand when someone passes. I'm using more of these rituals to kind of show some of the differences in our perspective on the Buddhist teachings than perhaps some other schools. So I'd like to start off with a reading. If you could please join me in Gasho. May this merit virtue be shared equally with all beings. May we together awaken the Bodhi mind and be born in the realm of serenity and enjoy. Namo Amida Butsu.
Namanda.
Namo Amida Butsu.
Namanda.
Namo Amida Butsu.
Namanda.
So I'm not going to keep, this is not to keep you in suspense, but this is kind of an interesting little question for you. I wonder if you're familiar with this, because this is something that we recite every service that we have, but we recite it in Japanese. And at the conclusion of this talk, what I'd like to do is talk about what's the difference from our perspective and what this represents as opposed to some of the other schools of Buddhism. So here at New York, the services are different than they are at Ekoji, maybe a little more in tune with how services are done on the West Coast with the temples that are predominantly still Japanese American and have many generations of followers. But like we had Shosuki Hoyo, which is the first Sunday of the month, which I know which we do also at Ekoji, where we honor those that have passed on in the month. What is a little different here is that what we do is we go through the list and we read the names. And so this month, unfortunately, as fall goes into winter and December and January are the months that we have the most names. So what we do is we read a Hyobyakumon, which means that we have a sacred reading about what the day is, the meaning of Shosuki Hoyo, and then we go through the names. On a positive note, or an interesting note for me, is that I sometimes butcher the Japanese names, even though I speak some Japanese names. Some of the Issei members have 3 Japanese names that you're trying to recite. But here in New York, I've got Russian names, Polish names. So I'm going through the list and I'm thinking in Japanese pronunciation. All of a sudden, I have a Polish name and I have to shift gears. So it's a challenge. But the idea is that for us as Sanghas, that we remember those who have passed on. And in this case, in a very specific, concrete way by reciting their names. But it reminds me of all of the other rituals, which I'm going to bring up here tonight. And again, I'm not focusing on the death ritual for what does death mean itself, but how in Jodo Shinshu, how we deal with a subject like death or someone's passing. Because at Ekoji, we don't have the traditional culture. So there are many services that are around in Japan and also here in most of the other Bisei temples about what a family does or what loved ones do when a loved one passes on. And what I'd like to do is express the significance of how it's interpreted by Shin Buddhists, how it's interpreted by the ministers, how we are trying to work with the families through this process. So I mentioned to you before that it's not uncommon for there to be a deathbed rite, that when someone passes, that the minister or the minister assistant, Eric has done them for me as well, thank you, Eric, will go to the family wherever they are and comfort the family when the person passes. Now, the idea is that this isn't a deathbed rite. Some people get that confused with maybe with Catholicism, that the minister's coming to make sure that their loved one is going to go on to the Pure Land. But in fact, what it is that it's a time for the family to gather. A lot of times in California, they'll gather the morning after someone passes so the family can be there, because it's not a blessing for the loved one, but it's a time for the family to hear the Dharma and to chant. And I think perhaps even more so than a Sunday service is the idea that chanting plays a very important role, because it is an expression of the Dharma that goes beyond a study lesson or a cognitive understanding. So what we do is that we do the chant, and that's the time where the family can relax and then a lot of times get very quiet and they realize that their loved ones passed on, and then the Dharma comes in. And so then that service, then the next service, of course, would be the funeral or the memorial service. which again, thank you, Eric has done so many for them when I'm not able to be at Ekoji. And the idea is that the funeral, again, is very much in line with this ideal behind Shin Buddhism, that the funeral is not for the deceased. We know that our loved ones are at the ultimate peace and reach nirvana, but is for the living. So the service is there for the family to hear the Dharma, for them to get together, to be with each other, and be able to get comfort out of that. And in California, you can have funerals that have 400 or 500 people. It's pretty amazing. You have people that come from all over the country, and then you see these connections, which is very nice, because as we know that we're in a modern world, we are so physically separated from a lot of our loved ones, that this is a time for them to come together. And even though it's not the greatest situation, it's a time for them to come together and honor their loved one. And most importantly, hopefully hear some of the teachings of the Buddha to help comfort them through this difficult time. Now, going on, again, this idea of how the Shin Buddhism looks at these Buddhist practices that are common in other schools of Buddhism, especially in Japan. The next service is the 49th day service. And the 49th day service is, again, done 49th day, hopefully before that time. For Japanese nationals, they want it to be on the 49th day because it's very important to them. And so what you do is you get together and you have a short service, and the family is still fairly distraught. We don't have this tradition at Ekoji basically anymore, or New York, but at other temples, they still have the service. And then what's interesting, again, how this Shin perspective is different than other schools of Buddhism, is that you might recall that the 49th day in Buddhism is the day that someone is reincarnated according to the sutras. And so in some schools of Buddhism, people take that very literally. That means that, you get together for a service, and then what you're doing is you're creating Buddhist merit, which I'll be discussing here in a moment, to help your loved one to be born into a better life so that they will come back maybe in a position to be able to reach enlightenment itself. But in Shin Buddhism, we honor the 49th day because that is the tradition. But the understanding is again, that we don't have to worry about the idea of reincarnation, because Shinran Shonin and Honen made it very clear, upon our physical death, we reach nirvana. So again, this is a time for the family to get together and to hear the Dharma and to understand the teachings of the Buddha. The next service is a year, and as a minister, it's very interesting to see the progression from the first night when or the first time someone passes, to the funeral, to the 49th day, and to the 1 year service. And there's a natural progression where people, they still have their grief. We know that grief never goes away completely, but the intensity hopefully will be less. I've unfortunately had some families where the intensity of the mourning is very strong even a year later. But for the most part, the families will be able to get together and kind of joke or have fond memories of their loved one, and have a more relaxed atmosphere about that. Now, when I started going to the Seattle Temple many years ago, and they would do the Shosuke Hoyo service, I was very confused. The idea, the stereotype, which I've talked about before in another Dharma talk, where with Obona Dore, it's like, oh, are you doing ancestor worship, which is this gross oversimplification of Japanese religion or spirituality. Oh, you're worshiping your ancestors. It's much more nuanced than that, as we are well aware. And as I'm saying, it's a reflection upon remembering the loved ones that have passed on. And then next month, we'll talk about the Eitaikyo service, which is something that we're trying to incorporate at Ekoji, where we do a memorial service once a year for the larger Ekoji Sangha. And we'll be talking about that closer to the date where we're celebrating that. But I think the important part is that in Shin Buddhism, we're not trying to create this, what we call Buddhist merit. And the simple way of thinking about Buddhist merit in many schools of Buddhism is that if you do a deed, for example, if you hold a service for someone, if you have a chant and you put the chant in the honor of that person, or if you do a donation and you put it in the name of that person, you're creating basically, quote unquote, good karma, or a storehouse of good intentions that accumulate. The more that you do, the better it is. And the idea is that when you physically pass from this world, then that is considered in the idea of reincarnation. As I said before in other Dharma talks, we do not tend to think of reincarnation very literally in Shin Buddhism. We reflect on it that in the past we have been here before, but we're not focused on future reincarnation because we know that we're going to reach nirvana upon our physical death. So it's a very different idea. So then when we do our services, we're not doing the services for the person. Interestingly enough, here in New York, I did a major funeral a year ago for a Japanese member, and most of the people in his family are not Buddhist. And so they've contacted me. They want to have a service in his name in January on his 1-year memorial. And they're very serious about this because they, in their perspective is they want to generate merit for their loved one that passed on. And so it's a different kind of concept. So the idea of merit gets back to the opening passage, which I said that we're very familiar with. So at the end of the chant, when we go Gani Jiko, at the very end, when every sutra, that we chant at the very end, we go into what we call in Japanese the Eko. And so this is traditional after doing chanting in Buddhism, no matter what school or denomination you belong to, the Eko is read afterwards in the language of the sutra that you chanted. And normally what you're doing is that you're giving this merit to someone or something. It's interesting that a lot of times people, that have looked at like Indian Buddhist practices in India will say, oh, well, the monks and nuns, they give up their secular world and they lose contact with their parents. One of the joys of studying at the Institute of Buddhist Studies is there's archaeological Buddhism as well, and that you look at archaeological evidence and sometimes it contradicts what is written. I think we can all relate to what we say is an idea in a faith-based or philosophy. Is that actually practiced? And actually they unearthed about 20 years ago in India a statue of Amida that a nun had inscribed in the back that this was dedicated to the merit of her parents. So we can understand that the idea of merit is very strong, but then Shinran Shonin and Honen in Pure Land Buddhism talks about we don't have to worry about merit. And so then I like to just read, you don't need to do Gasho for this, but I just like to reread what we do with the Eko, which gives you an idea of this Bodhisattva idea that we're not doing it for ourselves or someone specific, we're doing it for the larger good. And it says, may this merit virtue be shared equally with all beings. May we together awaken the Bodhi mind and be born in the realm of serenity and joy. So again, when looking at this in another way, when we talk about the ritual of chanting, this kind of takes the emphasis off of, why are we chanting? Is it for an outcome or is it for merit? And as a Shin Buddhist, I would say no. The idea that I've heard from many Japanese ministers, the idea is that we share the Dharma in one voice. I know that for me personally, when I came out of COVID and I was the virtual minister at Ekoji, I realized how wonderful it was, even though I was in California at the time, to be chanting with other people because I hadn't chanted with anybody in, over 2 years. And this idea of sharing one voice. The other thing is that, when you're in the Hondo, actually the former president of New York, who lives quite a way out of the city, she's in service every Sunday, but she was here in person. And she talked about how wonderful it is, the chanting, because you're surrounded by the chanting. You're surrounded by other people expressing the Dharma. So again, this whole idea of, in Shin Buddhism, especially when we look at, for example, like the rituals around when someone passes, we're not doing it as merit to say, take care of someone in the next life, that's assured. What we're doing is that, again, we're reflecting upon the Sangha, we're reflecting upon sharing the teachings of the Buddha. And then once again, as one voice, when we chant, it's very, very important. So I hope that this will give us some conversation this evening. I always look forward to the conversations that we have in the second part of Dharma Breeze, because people will bring up life experiences. And I'm sorry, because there's a couple of people here that have expressed to me that they've had quite a bit of loss of life recently. And I reach out to them and thank them for understanding that. I hope that this talk will kind of help them understand that our loved ones are taken care of, and that all of these services, all of these rituals are for us to express the Dharma. So if you could please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats, namadats. Okay, so now I'd like us to all do a group reading. If you could please join me in reading our pledge, which is attached. Join me in Gasho, please. Our pledge. Breaking out of my shell, I will share a warm smile and speak gentle words, just like the kind Buddha. Not becoming lost in my greed, anger, and ignorance, I shall think and act with an open mind, just like the calm and peaceful Buddha. Not putting myself first, I will share in the joy and sadness of others, just like the compassionate Buddha. Realizing the gift of life I have received, I shall strive to live each day to its fullest, like the Buddha who tirelessly works to liberate all. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Datsu. Okay. So if everybody, before we go into the discussion, if you can just join me in one more short sitting meditation. So again, if you can sit firmly in your chair, your back straight, feet flat on the floor, your shoulders relaxed. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Dots, Namo Dots.